Bitcoin would be the most successful thing you've ever seen in your life. For example, it took Microsoft 44 years to be $1 trillion. It took Apple 42 years to be $1 trillion network. It took Amazon 24 years to be $1 trillion network. It took Google 22 years to be $1 trillion network. It took Bitcoin 12 years to become $1 trillion network. And there's nothing else. Right. There is no other $1 trillion network. So what you have is a decentralized digital network, which is in essence transforming analog money or analog assets to digital assets. It's global. It's running everywhere on the earth, and it has been growing. It was growing at 200% a year. Try to remember when Amazon or Apple or Google grew. It was growing at 200% a year for a decade until March of 2020. And in March of 2020, that monetary fire that was burning at 200% a year hit the pandemic, and the rate of currency expansion increased by a factor of 3. We went from expanding the money supply at 7% a year to expanding the money supply at 24% a year. We're looking at the money supply expanding at 15% a year or more for the next 4 to 8 years. I think 10,000 companies or 10,000 projects have attempted to displace Bitcoin. I think they've all failed. The only way you're going to be successful with another crypto asset network is if you target a totally different use case than base treasury asset. So if it's a differentiated thing with a different market segment, a different use case, then perhaps. But in fact, the market has spoken. I'll say it again. In the history of the human race, we've never had $1 trillion digital monetary network. It's the most successful thing humanity has created. It is creating value and gaining market adoption faster than anything that we can point our finger at in the history of the human race. So, there's 100,000 entrepreneurs that would like to be Google or like to displace Facebook or like to displace iOS, and they're all going to have this is a better thing. It just seems irrational. When the other thing is 10 times as big as Bitcoin doing the same exact thing, then maybe it's logical. But right now the market is spoken, right? And if you don't actually accept Bitcoin, then what do you think about Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon? Because those things are growing much slower with much weaker network effects right now. Bitcoin transcends any company, any CEO, any country. It's spreading everywhere, and it truly is the most successful decentralized technology human beings can point toward. So I don't know what else you'd point toward in terms of decentralization other than this. So it's a $1 trillion network, and that makes it 1/10 the size of gold. And so and you're seeing it trading maybe $4, $5, $6 billion a day. So it's a suitable monetary network for a corporation or an individual that has a scale of investment in the billions or less. But if you wanted to store $10 to $100 billion, it's not quite big enough yet.
Gotcha.
And so there's a natural inertia. It takes a typical individual, it takes them 6 months from the point that they hear about Bitcoin to go through the educational process. And then from the point you decided you wanted to buy it, it would probably take you 12 weeks before you got comfortable with the on-ramp, the custodian, and the technique. I think a lot of people were against the automobile and electricity when it came out. Bitcoin is 21st century financial technology. It's $1 billion block of energy, manifested as sunlight. You can move it at the speed of light. You can program it. If you want to build a 21st century economy, you're going to need to embrace technology. It's not at all a bad thing for America to lead in the financial technology segment in the 21st century. And so dismissing Bitcoin is kind of like just dismissing any new technology. I mean, you could say the same thing about the internet. As you can borrow money to own Bitcoin, or you can borrow money against Bitcoin, demand's going to explode. It's going to mature as an asset class. And on the other side, that's going to draw the banks into this because they can't afford to ignore it.
Yeah.
But we're still early, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it is very early.
Look, I think the nimble fintechs, the Square and PayPal are nimble. They're going to kick the less nimble fintechs, the Google, the Apple, to think. And then you've got the nimble banks, the Celsius and the BlockFi, and they're going to tweak the less nimble banks. And, some will get a little bit in, like Morgan Stanley announced they're going to offer a Bitcoin fund through their financial advisors. But that's like just dipping their toe in it. Mm-hmm. Like, it's really anybody's market to have or not have, depending upon how progressive. And I think it's reasonable to say some large traditional institutions will get in, but many will not.
Right.
And some big tech companies will join and others will not.
Sure.
And that's what makes the market competition. This decade is the decade when we'll see which bank decides to get into it, and there will be some banks that don't. There'll be some banks that do, that handle the asset class. The ones that do are going to grow. The ones that don't are not going to grow.
And there's some arguments out there on the banking system itself that it potentially could be completely replaced with a lot of these new fintech startups. Is there any particular, brick and mortar bank that you see today that could make that digital leap that you would say, hey, I have a little bit of faith in this particular bank?